Hey everyone, just wanted to give you a quick heads up. The second Global Product Owner Summit is coming soon. You can get all the details at bit.ly/Product Owner 2024. That's bit.ly/Product Owner 2024. And it's all lowercase, all one word. Oh, and stick with us until the end of the episode to know the dates and the tracks that we have for you in this year's summit. But for now, let's dive into today's episode. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this bonus No Estimates for Product People episode. And this week, joining us from the beautiful city of Barcelona in Spain is Luis Garcia. Hey, Luis, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Vasco. Thank you for the invitation.
Absolutely. So Luis is a program manager at Formula Monks. He specializes in developing impactful digital products, and he has over 10 years of experience, several Agile certifications, and he applies Agile frameworks to meet client needs. His background includes a master's in computer engineering, an executive MBA, and he's also fluent in English, Spanish, and French. And he values diverse work environments and continuous learning. So, Luis, that was a short intro. Tell us a bit more about yourself and how did you come to experiment with No Estimates?
So I came to experiment about No Estimates very similar in time when I started my career in product management, product ownership. As a career, I started computer engineering, as you mentioned, back in 2011, I think is when I finished my master's. It feels like a long time ago. And I started as a software engineer. In a certain industry, actually in gaming, gambling, lotteries. And as I became an expert in that domain, I became as well, or I got the opportunity to become a product owner, product manager in around 2015. And it was in Iceland, from all the places where I started being a product owner, product manager. And there was a convention, I don't remember exactly the name, but there was one of the workshops where Woody Zuill was actually one of the speakers, and he conducted this workshop. That he didn't call it exactly No Estimates, but he spoke about forecasting and how we can answer the question when it will be done. That struck me actually quite a lot because I was fairly new, less than a year as a product owner in that organization. And I discovered actually the estimation process, it was becoming a bit of a pain to me, asking for estimations. And not only that, what estimations were being used for. It made everybody a bit uncomfortable. Conversations about what is the complexity, what is uncertain, what we have done in the past versus what is new, it made everybody very dynamic, right? And everybody was willing to have a conversation, to have an opinion. But when it came the moment of I had to ask, okay, when is going to be done? How long is it going to take us? Then people were much more quiet. They didn't want to answer, or even it became at times defensive. So I was
Do you have an insight as to why that was? Like, as you, of course, with the benefit of hindsight, now when you look at that reaction, why do you think that was?
So the industry that we were working for, it was lotteries. We work for governments, and the governments, they want to have a strict plan. They want to know that something is going to be delivered on a certain date, although it never gets done at that date, as we know as well from governments, right? Not every plan it gets done at that date, but they wanted to have that. And whatever piece of information we would give them, it doesn't matter how much caveats we would put, at the end, they would take it as a promise and as a hard commitment that if we are going to be delivered on the 1st of April, they do expect suddenly everything delivered on that date, the 1st of April, right? So people, they didn't want to give information anymore. They didn't want to give plans.
So they were hesitant, right?
Exactly. You were asking them, can we deliver on a certain date? And people didn't want to commit to anything. Even if providing that information would allow us to actually negotiate with the client new dates, because they knew they could be considered potentially as hard really commitments. And also because it wasn't helping in the conversation. When people had questions about what we had to do, it seems the conversation was about the when we are going to be able to deliver it instead of what we are going to do it and if it's the right thing to do at this stage. So yes, there was a bit of a back and forth. And at the end, I could even detect that some people, they were making up some dates because what does it matter? At the end, we're going to move them if necessary. So we will just give a very high level estimation, but we are not going to be discussing actually about why we deliver that estimation.
So, of course, that's kind of where it starts. We start to see a little bit of tension, perhaps hesitation,
Mhm.
sometimes even demotivation. People are not really interested so much anymore in the estimates they are giving because they will change, or whatever they say, they're going to get blamed for it anyway. So they kind of step back. And I guess that's when you started to experiment. So can you tell us a little bit more about how did you come to experiment with no estimates? Like, of course, we talked a little bit about what were some of the things that were happening before, but like as you got started, can you share a specific example of how you adopted no estimates and also what was the impact that it had?
Of course. Um, I started in an environment that I think it was a more suitable for no estimates at that moment, which was one of the teams that today we would call them platform teams. This is a team that was supporting other teams, and most probably the way of working was more Kanban-like than Scrum or plan-driven. So what we started doing is, if anything is more complex than a unit, right, than a one, whatever we want to call it, let's try to split it into between a unit and then the rest of it, right? And
And
then
what
let's
was that
focus.
unit when you talk about it?
So we started with what is the smallest thing that we can work on that is predictable? What is the smallest thing that we can work on that we know that we feel comfortable saying, yes, this takes this amount of time. And actually a unit, it could take either a week or a day, but it is something that it is the smallest thing that we can do of this piece of work. And we feel comfortable saying how much time more or less is going to take because we have done it in the past, or all the requirements are extremely clear, or, for whatever reason, the team feels very, very confident.
Okay, so that kind of brings up two aspects. So one is they had an understanding of the duration, maybe because of having done that before, but
Mm-hmm.
as I understand you said that they also had an understanding of the requirements. So they were not
Correct.
expecting any surprises. There were no fuzzy areas. They kind of knew what needed to be done. Is that what it was at the time?
Exactly. Yes.
Very good. So how did you get started then? So you started by first asking that question. If everything is more complex than a unit, let's split it. So for example, what did you do to split it? Like, did you have a conversation? Did you use acceptance criteria based splitting like Neil Killick often talks about? Did you use other
Mm.
strategies? How did you split? And then what did you do with that information?
We will split it wherever we needed it. I didn't want to have at that moment the feeling from the developers that they would have to split it in a way that is not logical for them. So sometimes we would split it at a product logical point, right? By acceptance criteria, but other times we would split it at a API point, right? You can describe something or acceptance criteria even from the perspective of a developer. So we are going to be finishing the development here at this stage of the backend. And even if that's too much, there's some areas that we still don't know. Okay, how far we can go? I will be able to produce an API that responds in certain cases, but perhaps it's not the full API that needs the front end. So that's how far we were going. The story still, we were not splitting it because we wanted to have documentation that it was based from the user perspective, but we were splitting the tasks to that level of granularity. And the developers at a certain moment, they would be the ones splitting those tasks. So they would know we would have a backlog of ones of units, and then a backlog of it requires more information. We still have to split it.
That's actually cool. So you had a list of things you already understood, what you called units or ones, and then you
Correct.
had a separate list, which were the things we don't yet understand. We need to either
Mm-hmm,
know
mm-hmm.
more or start splitting them before we can call this a unit. Is that what you did?
Exactly. Exactly. And then we would start being able to do some forecasting based on, okay, how much does it take to consume this amount of units, and how much time does it take to refine this amount of non-refined units, or raw units, let's say. And we could have already these conversations with management. When they say, why you cannot provide an estimation, we would know what information has to be provided or what has to be resolved in order for us to provide a good forecast, not an estimation, but a forecast. And that's when we started speaking with them in forecast terms rather than estimation terms, right? That we are using the information that the backlog gives us, and projections of our behavior or our consumption, the cycle time, in order to provide those projections.
For me, this is very interesting that first you said, okay, so we have this unit, and we could, by looking at the past, we could say how many units you could deliver per time span. But you were also able to talk to stakeholders about the things that could not yet be called units, right? Like you said, okay, so we have, I don't know if this is what you meant, but as I understood it, you said, so we have these 20 things here that we can't yet know how long they take, but we think it takes us a week to go through 5 of these and make them smaller. Is that
Exactly. Exactly. We basically started measuring everything, right? How long it takes us to take things from one backlog and move into the other one. Once it is in the backlog of the units, this is refined. How often does it have to go back into the other backlog? How long does it take for us to start it and to finish it? And so on and so forth. And once we started having those times, that's what we could provide as estimations. Okay, when you give us a big project, this is the amount of time usually it takes us to bring it into units. This is the probability that a project like this, it becomes this size as well, this amount of units, let's say. A unit takes us an average of this amount of time, right? We started also putting tags and categories into those units. We didn't want to have a unit that it takes the same amount of time. So how long it takes a unit that is backend versus front end, or how long does it take a backend unit that is more related to expanding endpoints or perhaps documentation versus one that is doing completely new stuff, calculations, and so on. So that's when we started providing a catalog of forecasting, and depending on the variables, we could forecast as well with a certain percentile, right? In a project like this, you're 80% of probabilities that this part actually it takes this amount of time, but then you have a 20% of probabilities that it will go beyond this time if these conditions are given.
Yeah, that's actually a much more insightful conversation with stakeholders, because then at that time they can say, okay, so let's say in 3 months you could probably refine, let's use the Scrum terminology, you could refine 20 items, and that's all the time we have. So let's not put 20 items into the backlog, because then by the end of the time we only have the refined stuff. We don't actually have the delivered stuff. And that's very important. And you said we could start to measure everything. So tell us a little bit more about that. Like, what were the metrics, the exact metrics you were keeping, and how were you, how were you keeping them updated? How were you using them to then make those predictions with probabilities, as you said?
So in this organization, we went as far as to measuring cycle time, which was the most important for us to see how long it takes something until it is refined and how long it takes something once it's refined to finish it, right? To see those deviations. If something is a unit, we wouldn't want to have something that it takes sometimes a day, sometimes 2 weeks, because if that's the case, we want to be able to split it even beyond. If something goes above that deviation that we chose, then let's split it again. And then they start measuring how often we split something after it has become a unit, right? What is the inflation? We call it what's the inflation ratio, right? How many units become 2 units after they have been already refined? In other organizations, when I introduced this concept, they were already there in the path of NoEstimates, and actually they were using some models like Monte Carlo, I think it was called back in the day, in order to provide that forecasting.
So they were using Monte Carlo with that data that they had collected to do the forecasting.
Exactly. Yes.
So when you think about implementing NoEstimates, now going back to that story that you were just sharing, like, you started using it and came up with the idea of units and the 2 backlogs and so on. Regarding that implementation of NoEstimates with that team, like, what was the hardest challenge or obstacle to use NoEstimates?
I think it's a bit of the name sometimes. When you present it to people, NoEstimates, they believe that you're just not gonna plan, or you will not be able to provide any forecast or information that will allow other people to plan. When you tell NoEstimates and then you have the opportunity to describe the entire process or the mechanics, they will sometimes tell you, oh, but that's estimates. It's just actually data-driven estimates, right? Or you will be using a different model that they seem excited, but they wouldn't call it NoEstimates. In fact, myself, I stopped calling it NoEstimates at a certain moment, because indeed, when I started working in consulting, I could see that the clients, they were directly against it. So I would instead presented it as a projections or forecasting, how we can forecast something based on the work that we have. and our behavior, right? That instead of giving an estimation from the team is, okay, based on what we have completed and based on the refinement and the information that we have left, what is the information that we can give you?
So this is a little bit about managing expectations in terms of how you
Correct.
communicate information to stakeholders.
Correct. That's right.
And was
Yes.
that like the hardest challenge to kind of come up with that language and come up with those concepts about presenting that to stakeholders?
I think the second challenge is to start getting enough information, right? No estimates, I think, is in it should be sometimes implemented in teams or in squads that are already formed. They're not squads that they're going through very turbulent times, so they are very recently formed. You can start using no estimate, but you have to understand that you will have to compile some data in order to use it later on. You can start compiling the data from day one, and you can start producing some of that forecasting from day one, but the accuracy of that forecasting will not be the same, right? After a team that has been working efficiently in a norming state for already months or even years. So perhaps that's the second challenge is how you can get all that bulk of information so that you can start already giving some forecasting.
Yeah, and that's actually a good point. So my own recommendation is that people use data based on 3 to 5 sprints. You can start at 3, but 5 would be a little bit better. And depending on the size of the sprint, you can go down to the week instead of the sprint. Also depends if the team is doing continuous delivery or not. If they are doing continuous delivery, you can use data from a week. But if they are not, if they're delivering only at the end of the sprint, then you are limited to that because no estimates and cycle time measures end to end, not small little steps in the middle, right? And so I talk about that like 3 to 5 week or sprint kind of rule of thumb. What is your rule of thumb? When do you think, if you start with a new team, that the team is stable, but if you start yourself with that team today and start measuring, when do you think you can use that data for forecasting?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I will link it directly to the stakeholder management as well, or how to explain these mechanics to people, which is once you start looking at the backlog and things start having a pattern. And once you start showing that to the stakeholders or people, it's much more convincing when you show them, you see, there is some predictability. Just by looking at the backlog, I can see how much a unit is going to take. And I can see how many units it makes a user story or a feature or an epic. And now we can have some predictability because I see the team has a certain velocity in both consuming units, but also on producing new units. This is refining them. And that's the moment when it's good. Now, a rule of thumb for me, what I've seen is I would go indeed around that period of time, right? Amount of iterations that is above 2, and it should be less than 6 because already you have enough iterations that you have learned enough and you have compiled enough information and you have gone through several refinements, right? At least in every single iteration, you will have a refinement and you will produce some units. So definitely, I would go even, perhaps I would be braver, let's say, and as soon as it's 2 iterations, I would start considering when we can start doing this forecasting.
Another aspect that is very important and interesting for me from your story is this idea of managing expectations and learning how the team adapts so that you can then communicate that forward to stakeholders. And I really like the concept of having 2 backlogs, one that we take work from, that's the units as you called it, and one we refine from. And kind of that builds in what I think is one of the core aspects of Scrum, which is this concept of constantly being refining work because we learn more and we need to adapt information we get from the previous sprint into the items that are going into the next sprint. And those are just some aspects that kind of stuck to my mind from the story that you were telling. But I imagine that going into a team and being so concrete and specific about the refinement process can be a bit off-putting, right? So talk to us specifically about the change aspect, right? Like when you go into a new team, when you introduce these ideas, what are the things that you have learned that help you communicate these ideas, these concepts to the teams that you work with?
Something that I have learned is helping people to see or define accountability very clearly, which is what moving items from one backlog to the next. It is absolutely responsibility and accountability of the team, right? The team will have full control. Nobody will be able to tell them what is a unit and what is not, or if something has to be refined further or not. We are the ones who will do the work, and we are the ones who will be able to give that information because we know it the best. And giving estimation doesn't give us so much control, because giving an estimation, we don't know what the estimation will be used for later on, if it's going to be used as a commitment or as a high-level estimation. But this method, it gives us much more control on that information that is provided, because it's much more granular and it's more accurate or precise, let's say, right? The level of precision is higher, and there is less chances to take it as a promise, because we have what we wanted to convey as information at a certain moment, which is the refined backlog, and we have the unrefined blunt backlog that is still, we cannot provide information on that one. If somebody wants us to refine it, then we can invest more time, but and expand the window. That window that you were mentioning, it keeps on moving, and you keep on refining and moving items from one backlog to the next one. But that window, if it needs to be expanded, right? If you want to have a backlog of, instead of 2 iterations ahead, you want to have several iterations ahead, then the team needs some information. Then the team needs to sit down and produce more. So I think that helped people to understand that we're not going to be doing something that's outside of our control. Like estimation sometimes is perceived by the engineers, but instead something that it gives more control on what information is provided to stakeholders.
I really like how you talked about this unrefined backlog. And because the team owns the process, then if somebody wants to know how long something in the unrefined backlog will take, then the first step is to spend time analyzing
Exactly.
And that's very often what is missing. And I remember even from the waterfall days, where we had a lot more estimates a lot earlier on in the development process, there was a lot of estimates that were done on one-liners, right? Like the system shall, and then you have like this huge concept that has not been investigated. There's no understanding of what it is yet, but you already need to say how long it takes to deliver. And to have those two categories, we can say something about the units, because they're usually, at least in my practice, they're about 1 day of work. Right, like you have the units, and then you have the unrefined backlogs items, which are items that we can't say anything about. There's too much fuzziness, too much lack of clarity about, and that really creates a negotiation with the stakeholders. Yeah, we can tell you how long that takes if you give us the time to go in and refine all of that work. And of course, that starts to bring in the tension between too much upfront planning and just enough upfront planning, which is what we want. And we want the stakeholders to make that decision.
Exactly. You start exchanging in estimations, or just direct estimations, you start exchanging precision for information, right? You don't have certain information, so you reduce the precision of your estimation, and then you provide the estimation. While with NoEstimates, you exchange uncertainty for the true information that you need, right? Instead of telling people, well, I will give you the estimation, it's less precise. Instead of an 80% of precision, is a 60%, whatever that means, right? I never understood what that truly means. Instead of that, well, I can tell you is what I need to give you a more precise forecasting. I need to remove this dependency, or I need to know when something is going to get delivered, or I need to know how many people we're going to have in the squad, etc. So we start having an exchange of information truly between the stakeholder and the team, instead of one direction, which is just tell me how much it takes. I tell you how much it takes. And then whatever it happens, we don't know from each other again until the project is not going as it was promised months ago. So that exchange of information is much more valuable, because it's based on trying to identify what is stopping us from giving more precision into what we're doing.
Now, when we talk about this unrefined and refined or unit backlog, we also need to then think about prioritization, because the first thing that comes to mind is you can't compare the priority of a unit to something that is in the unrefined backlog, because it's far too fuzzy. We don't understand it yet. So obviously this then impacts how you plan and prioritize work. So how do you do it this way these days, Luis? How do you prioritize work, given that you now have these two levels of backlog clarity?
So we do, when it comes to prioritization from product perspective, we're not speaking of, dependency mapping, or we do the typical scoring that any other product manager may be doing, right? I want to identify what is the most valuable thing that I have in my backlog, and that's what it goes next. But I don't treat the backlogs so binary as refined or unrefined. I treat them as a whole with different levels of maturity, let's say, on that pipeline. It's a window, and I have some things which are ready to go, or people are working on immediately, and things that are requiring some refinement. If we detect anything in overall that window, that it can be sometimes 2, 4, 6 sprints, it requires more priority at that moment. We can bring it all the way into development, and we start already refining and producing those units right away. So it depends very much on how do we score those features, and if we want to bring them right away into the backlog, then we sit with the team, we produce the units, enough units so that we can start working on and learning about it, so that we can produce more units as we move forward, right? Because you may be in situations that is, you may have incidents in production, right, that you want to resolve right away. You're not going to be resolving an incident because you don't have the units. The process should not stop you from fixing or producing value to the client, or some release that you have done recently, you obtain right away feedback from the clients and you want to start implementing it because actually it seems very important. This process of producing the units is to produce predictability and forecasting, but it's not really to stop anybody from producing the value, right? At the end, we are flexible, and at the end, we do sometimes the units even after the fact, after we have started the development, because we know what we wanted to do and how we wanted to do it, just so that we have the units for predictability once again, so that we can go back and say, when it happened, this incident, we know that it takes this amount of time or this amount of units to resolve it. Or when we have feedback like this from the clients, we know that usually takes this amount of units. And we start doing predictability around that as well. How many units we should be carving out in every single iteration after we have a release. How many units we are starting to carve out for incidents as well. We start finding some predictability. Oh, we have actually in the last one, we had many units more than in the other one. Okay, let's start finding a ratio. Let's start finding this friction in the data that we have. Because ratios are really good when it comes to metrics, because they put in opposite sides two different metrics, right? And you start finding then very interesting information. You don't use these metrics to actually push anything or to punish anybody, but actually to find how we can do this better.
And for me, the key thing is that you're measuring things, not people, right? Because estimates is about measuring people. You kept or you didn't keep your estimate. But when you measure things like throughput or cycle time, it's the inherent behavior of the system. It's not what anyone is doing, right? And it's always systemic because you have a team. It's not one person as well. And this brings me to the next question, because a very interesting question from my perspective is, of course, that let's say that you started a project with a client and you're somewhere in between the beginning and the end of that, and somebody will come to you and say, hey, how far are we, right? Like, how do you measure progress and success without using this traditional estimation process, and how do you communicate that to your stakeholders?
It's very similar to what we tell to people when we're speaking, for example, of the weather, right? What are the probabilities of rain within the next day or the next week or the next month? So we speak very much of probabilities on what is the probability of finishing certain features the next week. What is the probability of finishing entire epics or themes within the next month, within the next 3 months? We know that the probability of finishing probably the entire project in the next month is very low, but the probability of finishing in the next month or 2 months, it's much higher. And then we can start giving them ranges of periods of time that we know that it's quite probable that we will be able to finish it. We give them information as well on what is certain and what is not, right? What is still needs to have more information or refined or worked on in order to provide these ranges. So that is the information that we start giving, because even if it's not answering sometimes the need that the stakeholders have, which is when I will be able to go live with this, it gives them the information to have control as well. Because very often with estimations, if you just give them a date to the stakeholders, the only possibility that they have is either postpone or push harder.
Yeah, it's kind of a binary discussion
at
that point.
Exactly.
And we don't want it. We want to be kind of a mindful and deliberate discussion about what we do now, and maybe we'll do another project later, but not deliver everything in one go. And what are some of the tools or techniques that have been particularly useful for you in NoEstimates? We talked about measuring everything. So, for example, where do you keep the backlogs and how do you keep those metrics updated?
You can do this anywhere. I've done this in Jira using the highest, most premium versions or ADO, and I've been using these in Excel. In startups that we just started, we're using Excel, and it's good enough. So when it comes to tooling, it is as simple as it can get. You don't need to have any tooling or Google Sheets or any document that you can imagine. I've done it even in Post-its, right? That every single Post-it, it was a unit. And then every day when we're having the daily or in the planning, we would be moving these Post-its. And that's what I would recommend to people, to start with something physical. I wouldn't start with, okay, we have to do it in Jira. Now we have to go through all what it means in Jira unit. And maybe we don't have it configured in such a way, and we don't have tasks that can be divided in this way. I would start with something that you believe it can be done in paper. That if you can do it in paper, then don't worry, you will move it later on into some other system that will help you actually doing all these forecasting and estimations. As I mentioned before, in other organizations, they were using as well Monte Carlo, right? And they were bringing these to, there's some websites as well that already today they offer you these services, and you can dump your CSV and then you can obtain the forecasting. But I would start with something simple. So it feels that you can iterate on it. You can learn from the mechanics of the system, and then you can modify it. And
Yeah,
I wouldn't
absolutely. I
recommend.
really like that idea of starting simple. And myself, when I started with a simple Excel sheet where I kept the throughput information for every week, and then I could use that for forecasting. And the cool thing of keeping that data in a very simple format is that later on you can adapt to it, and you can move it, and you can change the format, whatever, and you always have that data, right? If you're using a very complex system like Jira, for example, then the data is kind of a black box. You don't actually have the data, you only have the nice graphs that it produces. So definitely starting with something simple so that we understand the mechanics and how to use the data would be my advice as well. And coming to advice, and we're getting close to the end here, Luis, looking back at your experience with adopting NoEstimates as a product person, what advice would you give to a team that may be right now considering to switch to NoEstimates?
My recommendation is the experimentation cost is very low. You can keep on giving your estimations if you want to, but try to do no estimates at the same time and see what happens, right? See the difference between providing those estimations versus providing a forecast. Or provide both actually to those stakeholders and tell them, we are experimenting with something else. Maybe we can, speak about this. We will still provide you the estimations. So experiment. Don't feel that there is going to be as much pushback as you believe there will be. People are more flexible to change, and what people are looking for is information to be able to help you as well. I know that many people, they feel defensive when they're being asked how long it's going to take, when it's going to get delivered. But at the end, what they want to have is an opportunity to help you as well on that process of building a product or building technology. So experiment with it because the cost is low.
Absolutely. And the information we're looking for is there to help us have better conversations about the project and the work that we are doing. That's a great point. Now, if there's one resource that you would recommend to our listeners that are considering starting their journey with NoEstimates, could be a book, a website, a podcast, a YouTube video, whatever, one resource that you think people should go and read or listen to, what would that be?
I would absolutely recommend the NoEstimates book from you, Vasco. Absolutely. That's it changed actually as well, not only my approach of NoEstimates that I had been already using for some years, but also the narrative is really good. It's not just a prescriptive solution, but it is a story, right? It tells you the story of a person going through this experience as well. I would follow people like yourself, like Woody Zuill as well, Hollow in Twitter, right? The typical people who are following NoEstimates. Just check the hashtag NoEstimates in Twitter and you will find many resources. I would recommend other books like When It Will Be Done as well. It's a popular book as well in this case. So those are the ones, but just doing hashtag NoEstimates either in Twitter or in Medium, you will find a lot of actually to learn. I would search as well for some of the forecasting methods like Monte Carlo, and then you can start discovering where it comes from if you want to go a bit more advanced. But to start with the concepts, I would start with those books and resources.
Absolutely. Great recommendations. Luis, it's been a pleasure. Before we go, do share with us, where can we find out more about you and the work that you're doing?
You can find me on LinkedIn. You will find Luis Garcia, but there will be millions of Luis Garcias most probably. So I'm Luis Garcia from Formula. You can also find me in luisgarcia.info. I explain a bit more about my projects in there if you want to learn more about me.
Absolutely. And we'll put the link to those on the show notes so that people can easily find Luis. And why not ask a few follow-up questions? I'm sure he would be glad to share his experience with you.
Absolutely.
Luis, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for your generosity with your time and your knowledge.
Thank you, Vasco. Likewise.
Hi there, Agile friends. Thank you for sticking around and listening to the details of the Product Owner Summit, this year's global summit dedicated to a critical Scrum role, the product owner role, of course. We'll have some amazing keynotes and 4 tracks filled with first-hand stories and experiences for product owners to learn more about that critical Scrum role. The summit will take place between April 23rd and 25th, so book your calendars. There will be loads of sessions for you to attend. One of the keynotes will be Dave West, the product owner and CEO at Scrum.org, one of the largest Scrum organizations in the world. If you want to know more, check out the details at bit.ly/product owner 2024. That's all one word, all lowercase, bit.ly/product owner 2024. We will also have 4 tracks. The 4 tracks will cover cross-functional product ownership. That's track 1. As Pixar's Ratatouille said, not every idea can be a great idea, but a great idea can come from anywhere. And this quote emphasizes the importance of a product owner being open to all ideas, regardless of the source, and also challenges us to focus on getting good ideas from everywhere and involving the whole team in the product owner role and responsibilities. The second track is Designing Products for Growth, where we explore how to craft products ready for scalable growth, merging practical strategies with innovation. The idea here is to learn to design products for growth, whether it is sales or customer acquisition. The third track is Know Your Users, user-centric approaches for agile development. In this track, we learn to master user-centric techniques in agile development, to deeply understand customer needs and transform insights into meaningful UX designs that focus on engagement and satisfaction. This is a track ideal for innovation-focused agile teams. And the fourth track, one of the most exciting tracks in my opinion, is product development with AI, ideas for product owners. Not only do we discuss about using AI in the products, but also AI for product owners to learn to make a bigger impact with the help of the AI tools that we already have. The Product Owner Summit will also present to you great opportunities to network with your peers. So get your ticket and join our Slack. You can get the ticket and join the Slack at bit.ly/product owner 2024. As always, we have free tickets and also the paid tickets that help to support this podcast. So check them out at bit.ly/product owner 2024. That's all lowercase, all one word, product owner 2024. I'll see you in the summit floor.